Okay, once again, good afternoon. Welcome to the seminar, which is starting right now. So we're very excited to welcome you on this first session of the Urban Models Seminar. So I'm Clémentine Cotineau, and together with my colleagues Ruta and Ali from TU Delft, we're very happy to see this project coming to life and starting its own life. So during this session and over the next 10 months, we are going to receive once a month an expert of urban study and urban modeling. And with each model that they will be presenting, we're going to ask one overarching question, which is, what are the unforeseen consequences of urban model simplification on our understanding of cities? So urban models are simplifications of reality, and those simplifications are also, we can call them also modeling choices. They can be implicit or explicit, but in any case, they have consequences on how we view cities, on how we represent cities, and therefore now how we act on cities. So this is especially true for models that have become urban classics. I'm thinking, for example, of the Alonso model or the Schelling model. And at that point, when models are that famous in the field, they are appropriated and used by scholars, but also by policymakers in a way that does not always fully pay attention to the original simplifications and modeling choices. And so tracing the discrepancy between model results and empirical analysis back to the model's core assumptions and design is crucial in our sense, and that's why we're organizing this seminar, in order to provide guidance on how we can use models appropriately, how we can avoid misleading conclusions based on those models, and ultimately on how we can create better models. So in this monthly seminar, we're going to have 10 sessions. We are going to focus on several major urban models, which have durably shaped how we study cities. So you can see them here on the slide. They will be presented and debated by urban scholars who have studied, critiqued, and updated those models to fit contemporary urban challenges. We aim to open a new academic debate with you on those analytical urban models, and we attempt to create, at the end of it, a comprehensive analysis of how those models circulate and how it impacts their life, their consequences on policy. So more practically, we want to build a repository of resources about those very classic models. There is a lot of literature about them, but what we want to create here is a podcast series that has some coherence. So we've asked all the speakers to follow a similar framework for this presentation, and also to answer this big overarching questions of the unforeseen consequences of models on how we view and act on cities. So we hope to hear every time from each presentation over those 10 months, a description of the model, of its biography, its origins, and its international and interdisciplinary circulation. And we want to hear about the impact that the model has had on urban research and on the policy community. I'm very happy today to introduce our first speaker, Denise Pumin. She is an emeritus professor of geography at University Paris 1. She's an expert of urban theory and urban modeling. And among her many achievements that I will not list today, because we only have an hour and a half, Denise has co-founded the Paris Laboratory Géographicité. She's also founded the scientific journal CyberGeo, European Journal of Geography. She has also worked on the first agent-based model that works with cities as agents, the SIMPOP suite of models. And today she will present the model of central place theory and its impact on how urban hierarchies and spacing are approached in urban studies and planning. I'm very pleased and honored to have Denise as our first speaker, and I will hand over to her for 30 to 40 minutes of presentation, and then we will have a discussion and questions. So throughout the talk, you can type your questions on the chat, and Ruta will be moderating this chat and ask your questions at the end of the talk. Unless you really want to intervene yourself with the microphone, then you can indicate it at the end of your question. That's it for me. Thank you very much once again for joining, and I leave the floor to Denise.
Thank you, Clémentine. First of all, I would like to congratulate Clémentine and Ruta for having initiated this seminar series, which is very appealing. And I thank them to inviting me to start. I feel honored to be the first speaker, and moreover to speak about Chris Thaler, who is a big figure in the urban field. I apologize for the persons here who know very well and perhaps better than me this work. And but I am happy to be able to discuss at the end of the talk and to answer questions if you want. So we hesitate between theory and model regarding Chris Thaler, and it is well known in English under the label central place theory, but some people prefer to speak of models. We will see that this can be misleading sometimes. The appearance of the model starts in 1933 with the book published by Walter Chris Thaler, which is actually the content of his doctorate thesis defended at the University of Erlangen in 32. And the title is a bit surprising because it is not about cities, which is Stadt in German, but the neologism Zentralen Orte in a region Süddeutschland, which is rather broad. And the approach is about from economy and geography, and looks about regularities, Gesetzmäßigkeit, in the special organization and development of settlements having urban functions. So in his book, the first lines describe the objective of Chris Thaler. His aim is to explain, meaning searching for laws, the size, number, and spatial distribution of cities that are defined as centers supplying services to the population. He used, for developing the theory, a mix of concepts from geography and economy, mainly the notion of centrality, where centers are providing services, the supply side, and rural areas being defined as complementary regions where the demand is located. The transportation costs are supported by the clients. So they chose usually the closest place offering the service. There is a hierarchy of services. This is a principle that Chris Thaler borrows to Menger since the 19th century. He classified services according to the frequency of their use, their spatial range, and Chris Thaler defined that precisely as the maximum cost that the customer accepts, because it includes the transportation cost. The location of services is also constrained by the profitability threshold, which is the number of clients that are required to make the sustainability of the supplier. And there is a principle of embeddedness. The higher centers include all the services that are in the lower level service centers. I used this figure for the students to explain how it's really a theory, because all those fundamental concepts are linked together in a real explanation and enabling also to predict how many urban centers will be present in a region at that level of and offering that level of services, and how they will organize themselves in space. The novelty of such a presentation is that it is an abstract construction, not a description of reality. It is a constructivist posture, which was inspired by Max Weber, the sociologist, Alfred Weber in his model of industrial location, and Werner Sombart for the organization of industries. And this epistemology is new compared to what existed at the time in German geography, the Landschaftsgeographie, that was mostly interested in the morphological description and in vertical explanation of the locations of geographical objects. On the contrary, Christaller search for regularities and neglect the singularity of places. This also is grounded in an economics theory of the city, saying that cities' main role is to supply economic function, provision of private and public goods and services. And this is different from what was said 1 century before, for instance, by a geographer like Cole, who grounded his urban theory in the circulation, and the Fourier geography was essential for his development. So here we have something which derives from the economic functionalism of Karl Menger. The other novelty brought by the theory is that it can be tested through measuring a diversity of indicators for identifying the level of urban functions that are present in a center. And there are several means of objectivation that are used, computing statistics, graphings, drawing maps, and so on. And the validation of the theory is ensured by those computed comparisons for several regions. And Christaller insists for explaining the possible observed deviations from the model by categorizing those deviations in 3 types that may be more or less compatible with the theory. So here are the schematic presentation, what is called usually the model that are derived from the theory, provided that there is somewhere an homogeneous plane where the population density and the income is evenly distributed. And Christaller describes a series of 5, 6, 8 levels of urban centers that display the services on a service area, a market area around them. And he develops 3 kinds of possible theoretical network based on market principle. You have the maximum possible number of centers in space. The transportation model authorized to restrain the transportation expenses in the system. And in the administrative model, the location of cities would be principally determined not by the competitive market, but by the necessity of including each center in some administrative region. And this, as a consequence, in the relative number of cities at one level compared to the previous or upper level of 3, 4, or 7 according to the applied principle. These figures is about southern Germany. You see, including a French city, Strasbourg, a Swiss one with Zurich. And you already see that between the theory of the derived hexagons and the observed reality, Wirklichkeit, you have different geometrical figures, but that keep a kind of regularity in forms, especially the circular market areas around centers, whatever the size, and the higher spacing of the largest centers compared to centers of the smaller levels. So there are counting of distances, deserved area, average population, total population of market areas, and the number of centers that serve this population. I have to tell something about this person of Christaller. You will see that it is important for analyzing the reception of this model. Walter Christaller was slightly wounded during the First World War, and after it, he spent some time in different jobs, and he was a leftist person, being member of the Social Democrat Party. He decided before the 30s to become a student again and studied economics at Erlangen University. But his thesis, as we have seen, was made under the supervision of a professor in geography, Professor Gratman. And he even got an habilitation at Freiburg in 1937, but had never any academic position. He acted as an expert in planning institutions at Berlin and Freiburg, and perhaps being an opportunist, took the opportunity of continuing to work in his main sphere of interest, which was regional planning and theory of a good spatial government. So he became a member of the National Socialist Party in 1940, and this, of course, is considered by certain as a major difficulty in accepting Christaller's model. And he exerted as an expert at an office for planning and Landschaft, the land use organization, and which was funded by Himmler in order to better make an adaptation because between the structure, the spatial structure of the Reich with the Dutch population. So after the war, it was a bit difficult for Christaller to adapt again, but he also had a partial success, we will see that. He was never accepted in academics. And he even became a member of Communist Party in 1945, coming back to his previous ideology, and in 1959 as a member of the Social Democrat Party. So the international recognition of the importance of his work was belated compared to the publication of his book. He got reviews from German colleagues in the 1930s. They were rather critical because of the strong nomothetic orientation of the work. But in parallel, some geographers started immediately to try to apply the theory in different countries, like Estonia by Kant and Germany by Schleyer. The interest for the model was raised at the first time in Amsterdam, IGU Congress 38, but with many doubts about the theory, which was considered as too rigid and did not fit well with the realistic trend and exceptionalist tendencies of the time. So the full success of Christaller's model occurred in 1960 at the Lund Symposium in Urban Geography, organized by the IGU Commission. And there, Christaller met Eduard Ullmann, Brian Berry, Walter Izard, so prominent names in geography and regional science, who appreciated much the deductive reasoning in geography as applied by Christaller. And the enthusiasm was such that in his 1962 book published on theoretical geography, William Bungay dedicates the book to Walter Christaller, considered as the father of theoretical geography, initiator of spatial thinking, and for a while, central place theory was really accepted and recognized as a paradigm for the new geography that developed in the US during the 50s and 60s, in Sweden, in Britain in 60, and later on in Central Europe. In 1964, Walter Christaller received the honorary medal of the Association of American Geographers, and his book was translated in 1966, but only partially, and this is very important, by Carlyle Baskin. And he also was honored by University of Lund and Bochum in 1967. And in 1968, there was a special issue of Geographische Zeitschrift in honor of Christaller. So now we can denunciate the myth of the non-recognition of Christaller's model by the geographical and regional scientist communities. Actually, he was known. He didn't be unnoticed. And this can be seen. I apologize for making so much name dropping, but I think the name will speak to many of you, both the name of the people and the name of the journals where they presented the central place theory, together with the date of the publication, which was sometimes very early. Eduard Ullmann was completely seduced at first. He met Christaller in Lund, and he said he had the same kind of ideas that he explained in his theory of location for cities, comparable to what Christaller said. Schleyer's work was used by Richard Dickinson in his book on the Special Regional Organization of Europe for Germany. He used directly the functional typology that Schleyer enunciated according to the Christaller's theory principles, but he don't quote the theory, and they keep a purely empiricist attitude. He was not at all seduced by the new geography. So, however, in 1961, Brian Berry and Alan Praed gather in a book of 150 pages the list of references quoting central place theory, either for theoretical investigations or for applications from all parts of the world. It's a really huge success. And of course, among those works, we can quote Brian Berry, 1968, Geography of Markets and Retail Distribution, which really exemplifies in detail the theory and make proposals for improving some of the measurements. On the contrary, among French geographers, the theory was put aside, and it is unfortunate. For instance, Georges Chabot had met Christaller in Amsterdam in 1938, but even in his book on cities in 1948, he quotes the theory without noticing about its importance and using it in other developments. The French specialist of urban network in French, the thesis directed by Pierre Georges in the 60s with Michel Rochefort, but Raymond Dugrand, Bernard Cazer, and many others, they use the same principles. They measure the influence of urban centers in their surroundings for a variety of urban functions, but they never quote central place theories. They don't say they are inspired by this theory. And perhaps, however, the influence of Christaller was broader in geography rather than in regional science, which were a bit reluctant regarding Christaller and preferred the economic purism of Auguste Lusch. So I want to insist on all methodological developments that were made at that time, as early in the 50s and 60s, for developing the theory. But of course, the school of William Garrison at Washington State University in Seattle was very much interested. Brian Berry was there as well. Many other scholars, like Gettys, for instance, speaking about the theory later. A man curious of mathematical innovations as Leslie Curry was, you see, early interested also in the theory, and he participated in the Lund meeting in 60. Ron Joston also made early papers about the theory. And William Clark, Gerard Rushton. The seminal paper by Beckman and Macpherson is a first, published in the Journal of Regional Science, is an attempt to algebraize more than Christaller had done, the theory by proposing equations for the mathematical description of the relationship between the levels in the hierarchy of central place. Whereas Richard Preston investigated the more in the concept and later on in the history of reception of the theory, and so on. Dassey, also very important theoretician of new geography, tried a one-dimensional version of the theory. Claude Ponsard used the graph to describe this type of hierarchy. John Parr in Scotland also made a lot of text and theoretical improvements to the theory, trying to formalize what Christaller didn't completely, the temporal change, possibly. Colette Cauvin and Henri Raymond applied spectral analysis to the spacing between cities. Hubert Béguin also was interested with Ponsard. And we also, those are examples of the applications, not in planning, but in academic research, using a central place theory for testing the theory and identifying the specificities, the local regional specificities in different countries. So we have Estonia very early, Germany, of course. In China, Skinner, as early as the middle 60s, made a lot of investigation about the structure of the spatial structure of markets, including temporary markets, temporary marketplaces in Asia. Application in Nigeria, US plains, of course, Greece. Vlora applied it for the whole of Italia. And Sylvie Adam, in a Rouen thesis, tried in vain to find hexagon around cities in France. So later on, more deeper analysis of the importance and implication and influence of Christaler's work were proposed by Richard Preston, a Canadian geographer who make many reviews. Mechtild Rössler, a German scientist who is working at UNESCO now, made deep research in the archives about the possible role of Christaler in the Nazi government, which was restrained to actually offices for research and development of possible plans that were never applied. So his actual and physical role among the Nazi is probably not very important. Marie-Claire Robic made a very interesting survey about the development of the theory, its antecedents and consequences, as well as Géraldine Jamin, who analyzed the transnational circulation of the theory. And recently, Anne Radef developed the consequences in China of the translation of the book that occurred in 2013, if my memory is good. We also noticed a few but very determined opponents to the theory, and they refused to speak of theory, about central places. They speak about models. They have detected fallacies. And French people writing a didactic book was very critical against the theory, but for false reasons. When you try to understand the intellectual reasoning, and this was a famous contradiction by Henri Raymond, who defended Christaler, because of course Jacques Chebling was attacking Christaler about his interpretation, and Chebling don't know well what is exactly Christaler's theory. Georges Nicolas criticized the mathematical geometrical development by Christaler, who are possibly mistaken, false. And recently, Trevor Barnes, entering perhaps the recent cancel culture, decided that Nazi was the adjective to be keep in mind, keep with about Christaler, and the critics start from this supposed attitude, which of course was perhaps different. Oh, sorry, I mentioned. Sorry. Yes, Peter Taylor recently also is really angry about the supposed hegemony of central place theory when speaking of urban hierarchies. He would like a broader attention to networks, of course. So what if we try to sum up briefly what is right and what is wrong in this model? Of course, it is not the fact that nowhere there is something like an homogeneous plane. The Christaler's model is not about the geometry, exact geometry of the model. Also, the fact that he draws graphs and maps is probably an important factor in the influence of his theory, because 1 century before, in 1841, the French Jean Reynaud had developed exactly the same theoretical principle, starting from the grouping of craftsmen in villages, making services for the agricultural villages around them, and 3 or 4 levels of urban centers nested with hexagons around them, and explaining the organization of the urban hierarchy. But this had no consequence in the literature. It was rediscovered by Marie-Claire Robic in 1982. So perhaps if Reynaud had drawn his hexagons, he would have more success. We don't know. Anyway, it is not true either that the model would lack of micro foundations, as it was said in Real Scientist or Economic Literature recently. And I will demonstrate later on that it is not true. Actually, the Christaller's reasoning starts with a person going to make purchase and a doctor distributing his services around him. Christaller was absolutely conscious that he wanted to make simplifications in order to eliminate all the contingencies in a geographical landscape for founding something truly theoretical and establishing regularities. So he knew that reducing the cities as service centers to the population was not enough. He knew that manufacturing or tourism could create urban agglomerations, but he insisted on centrale Orte, central places, precisely because he didn't want to charge all his geographical objects with all the connotations that are attached to the cities. So perhaps the geometrical deduction he made is wrong. Perhaps many people tried to decide about that, but it is not so important. What is more, perhaps, and more wrong is the hypothesis that people will go for each service to the closest place offering it. Multi-purpose trips already were 30% of the shopping budget purchases in the 80s. Recently, I discovered a statistic of 36% of Chinese purchase being made online. So the distance is not so important now and cannot found a complete theory of urban centers. And of course, with increasing urbanization, we cannot still say that the role of cities is to serve the countryside, a distant population. So we can, however, probably keep the model as describing a rather long, several centuries long history of urban centers that were in relationship with their rural surrounding. And we have to develop and to revise the theory for encompassing other periods of urban evolution and providing theories for that will be evolutionary for urban systems, and a complex theory, of course. So what is really striking is the interdisciplinary influence of the theory, because in the consumer behavior for marketing and also behavioral ecology, central place is used as such and it has also a big role in archaeology for looking for potential ancient locations having a relationship between different centers, and also in national planning, so at higher scales, Christaller obviously since at least 83 played a role in the way the spatial planning in China was developed. For instance, you find in an archaeological Chinese journal this map of the Neolithic sites in a part of central China. And look at the way it is designed. Obviously, central place theory is behind such a figure. The impact on urban policies is more difficult to track. There is probably where my talk is not sufficiently developed. I didn't find complete source about the extension of the planning operations having explicitly used Christaller's model. Indeed, in Germany, the question of division of the and special organization of the German territory was the important question Christaller was ready to tackle. And he mentions later his fascination for atlases and trying to find possible location for cities that exist or not. And he acted as expert for spatial planning in Third Reich. And he founded a working group on central places in 1938 on that question. He was recognized as a theoretician for communal Wissenschaft. And it is also new in Germany because here urban planning was rather limited to a city. There was a questioning about the relationship between cities and their rural environment, but not so much for systems of cities as a whole. And the determination of Christaller to optimize the regional subdivisions through the rationalization of the economico-geographic organization of society in space is really something that has marked the planning in Germany. Not so much the plans that he designed himself for the Poland-Wartenow region, the conquest of Germany during the war on Poland, because it was not applied in a concrete way at that time. But after the war in 1965, the legislation in Germany for the special organization of the country takes inside the principles that were developed by Christaller's theory. And for instance, the distribution of public services according to the size and the status of the cities in the urban hierarchy with 4 levels of centers is still active, and it was used for allocating, for instance, recently the migrants in different regions, lenders and cities inside the lenders. And the model was used also for reforming the municipal subdivisions. There is only 10,000 communes now in Germany compared to the 30,000 in France, and this was due to the reforms. Several, there is a work by Wollmann on that topic. So I already said that in France, also the policies of métropole d'équilibre were clearly inspired by the theory. It was not explicit in the documents. But there were applications towns in possibly in India, in the Netherlands for the polders. And I have read a paper I didn't find again, recognizing that indeed the rules were applied for establishing the settlements, and they discovered later on, because of the multi-purpose strips, that they had installed too many small settlements. The central place theory also is used for the new towns in Israel, and especially in the colonies, and perhaps so, according to Anne Radef, in this system of city governing county, which was developed in the 80s in China. On the general representations of cities, I think that also there were other initiatives before. It's really the Kristallers model, a benchmark for the development of a nomothetic approach in the study of cities, and it opens the way to cities as systems within systems of cities. And it is latent in each time a big planning operation is decided to create order in society through space, which is of course also a controversial issue. In the perspective, still the influence is effective. For instance, among the many papers that are published today, you find a thesis about mathematical programming of the central place theory, application of multifractals to these systems. You find how big data may help to find again a central place organization among the traces that you find in social networks. And perhaps big data the central place theory can help, can be used as a tool for structuring the analysis of the big data, and a simulation model using NetLogo was provided for showing that just using the definitions in the book of Kristaller about the construction of a central place system, you can simulate this emergence using a simple NetLogo model. So we also could imagine how this can inspire the analyses that are made at broader scales, for instance, the Silk Roads on continental scale, and also the centrality of these depending on global networks is, for instance, attested by Céline Rosenblatt, who finds among the subsidiaries of transnational firms structures, centrality structures that are both defined according to a distance proximity, contiguity, and a network connexity. So there is still the centrality concept has many possible developments in the future. And here I will acknowledge the contribution of Mechtil Rossler and Marie-Claire Robic, because I borrowed many of the ideas they developed in their writings together with other persons, and all mistakes are from me, of course. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Denise, and also thank you for keeping the time exactly. So we have a full 35 minutes for questions, comments, discussion. So I invite everyone who wants to ask a question to either to type it in the chat and to indicate if you want to ask it yourself or if you prefer our moderator Ruta to do it. So I will leave a little time for people to ask questions. And maybe in the meantime, I will ask one that I have in mind. So you mentioned the impact of the theory on planning, but I was interested in this and in relation to the series of seminar in general. Is it possible to identify the main misunderstanding of the theory and its impact on planning? So I have a suggestion because it's a complicated question, but for example, this difference between a city and a central place that is acknowledged, that you acknowledged at the beginning, the fact that Kristalla was very clear in talking about central places rather than cities, which are more complex, more diverse. Do you think that kind of misunderstanding has had many impacts, negative impacts on planning when Kristalla was used to plan new towns, new regions, polders, for example?
Yes, thank you for that question. I already mentioned the bad surprise in the Dutch polders that was created by a too precise by what I would call a static conception of the theory, leading to develop a too large number of small centers adapted to slow movements of the population and to the rule for getting to the closest place offering the service. Whereas when the system evolves, of course, people and the speed of circulation increases, people and also the organization of daily life is different. People grouping their shopping in the same place and they choose a higher level in order to be able to make these multi-purpose trips that are so designed in the literature. And this is known since the 70s, the 80s. There were marketing studies about the behavior of consumer that describes that. So when I don't remember exactly when the polders were established, but already there could have be a sense of we design a system, we plan it, but it has to evolve with time, and the population will grow older, and there will be less children, and so on. You see, and those mistakes, unfortunately, were made often, not only in the polders, but if you think of the suburbs, where at the beginning residents were authorized or established without enough services. And when new towns were created with more planned services in order to better serve the population, the services were not always designed in order to follow the further evolution in age of the population. And so there are typical planning mistakes, but which have been made in many, many different places. I don't know if this can be said coming from the model itself, which is a static presentation of a situation at a given moment.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And just to let you know, we had a contribution by Evert Meyers during your talk, referring exactly to the Dutch polder application of Kristalla. So it's in the chat for everyone if you want to see that. There are two questions, so I will let Ruta take over.
Thanks. Before reading a question from the audience, I would like to ask one myself. But before, also thank you very much for your great overview, and it's very nice to know and to hear how extensive the application of this model was, and to how many different countries it's spread. And my question is that central place theory is often first or one of the first in the handbooks, and I remember in when I was studied, a teacher also introduced it the first among other models. And is it because it is historically one of the first attempts to explain organization of the cities, and therefore it has a long history, so it created its status over time? Or is it something else that put it at the forefront of other theories? So its complexity, its simplicity, applicability, influence, or something else? Thanks.
Oh, yes, a good question. I think that there are two answers. Perhaps is it? No, it is not the first law of geography, which is the gravitational model, and which was described before, but which could not receive the same it is a more partial theory. It is a theory of movement, so it is very broad in possible applications. And at the time, the information, the data about movements were not so well known in order to develop a full theory of circulation. Also, this was a thematic discussed in the 20s, the 30s between the two wars. But the data and the instruments were not there to build upon the first law of geography, something which would have been indeed the first big theory of geography. Also, it is present in Christaler's theory. So why is it so important? I think it is linked with the fact that it deals with cities, even if cities are not all central places, and central places are not all cities, but anyway, and cities are everywhere in the human societies. They represent a kind of geographical object and a special organization of society, which which can be observed anywhere and at any time in the last centuries. So you can apply the theory anywhere, anytime, in history, in archaeology, in geography, and the theory is sufficiently inclusive, because dealing with the number of cities, with their size, their spacing, and their major activity, which is being a place of circulation and the provision of goods and services. And you see, it is the broadness of the objects that are taken by the theory, I think, which is responsible for the large audience that the model received.
Thank you. Then a question from Sombrita. Is there any evidence that there was any dynamics involved in the model? What happens to the organization when a new central place emerges? And indeed, under what conditions could new central place then emerge?
Indeed, the question is tackled by Christaler himself in his book in 33. There are 50 pages that are dedicated to the analysis of what he has not yet considered. in the second part of the book, he developed regional systems in detail, and this was not all translated by Baskin. So it is not in English, but in German. And he managed to try to explain within the theory the deviations, the differences he observed between the systems of cities depending on such and such region. But in those 50 pages in the third part, Christaller speaks about the limitations of his theory, and he tried to predict what is going to happen in a further evolution of urbanization. He himself admits that he has found too many small settlements as compared to what could be expected from the upper levels of the urban hierarchy. But he doesn't go fully until the idea that those, yes, he says probably some of them have been abandoned because of rural exodus to the city. But he doesn't develop a full evolutionary theory of the urban hierarchy. And moreover, he don't provide equations or representation, graphic representation of this, which is important for the diffusion of a theory. And third, it is not translated in Baskin's book, which of course for the majority of English readers is like if this didn't exist at all. So the dynamic is to invent, starting from Christaller's theory, and this has been done by many authors later on. And I think that considering one has to consider that, but any further urban theory, in my view, should embed central place theory as a first step in the urban development, because the dependency of cities to their local environment in the centuries before the Industrial Revolution and even before the 20th century was enormous, and many explanations of such and such urban development are linked to what happens in the surroundings of the city. At the beginning, the city were a small single territory together with their rural environment, of course, like in the antique time and even still in the Middle Age for a long time.
And could you please explain and discuss what does Christaller mean by optimal? Yeah, yes. What is the optimal number of centers, of sub-centers?
Yes, he develops the criteria he uses. Optimal in the model of organized according to market principle is to find a configuration where the customers can find, for a given amount of expense to be made on such and such product, the consumers find the maximum possible number of centers. And it is a way of paving the space with points at the summit of equilateral triangles. Okay. In the system obeying to the what he calls the transportation principle, you have a change in position, but also in number of the centers. There are less less large number of centers than in the market principle. But you make economies on the length of the roads linking the centers. And in the administrative principle, and we see here that the importance that Christaller dedicated to this aspect comes from his concern for the way of dividing regions within a national country and allocating the services to the population in those subdivisions. So he also takes into consideration that 7 centers is a possible solution for serving cities that would depend of a higher center fully and not sharing the customers with other subdivisions. But he says in the studies he made of the urban systems in southern Germany that the market principle, K equals 3, is the most frequent observed. He finds 2 or 4 in the case of Strasbourg only because of the linear organization of the Alsace. So you see, he tries to find explanations for the differences between the models, and the easiest explanation can be either from the distribution of population, from the physical geography or political decisions, and so on.
Okay. And did Christaller recognize?
Sorry, I didn't answer the question about optimum. So it is optimum in this frame. In this frame, if my criteria are how to provide services to a population with such and such number of centers and such criteria for accessibility and so on, what can I do? How can I design that system from scratch? Sorry.
And did Christaller recognize the prior contributions by Reynaud and Langhart about talking about the hexagonal structures?
Reynaud, I'm not sure that he noticed that this came to his attention. The French geographers he met in the congresses didn't know about Reynaud. Nobody spoke about him, so probably not. But the other name you mentioned, the Austrian geographer, yes, Langhart. What is the name? Sorry. What other name did you say, Ruta?
Langhart.
Langhart, yes.
Yeah.
He knew, he quoted him. Yeah. There were indeed many persons who were interested in Germany in between the wars and in US as well by the role of center of services in rural areas. And there was a real concern. There were many surveys and trying to optimize the situation of these rural areas at that time. And there are a lot of publications about the service centers and yeah.
Okay, I was just asking Evert to ask a question by himself, but he didn't respond me yet. Evert, are you here? Okay, then I will read it. Please.
I'm sorry, I had to unmute.
Oh, great.
Yeah, I was wondering about the contemporary relevance of central place theory, because well, if you think, for instance, about Delft, it's surrounded by so many other cities, and actually also quite equally sized cities. It's completely at odds with what central place theory would predict, right? So quite kind of equal spacing of similarly sized cities. And here we have so many cities together and so many spheres of influence of cities are overlapping. So what is, in your opinion, the contemporary relevance of central place theory?
Oh. Good question. Yeah, thank you, Eva. Yes, it depends of the place of the world you consider. In many countries where rural population is still numerous and cities are building, the spatial organization that is developing is not far from what would be expected from a central place theory. You mentioned a country, yours, which is somehow an exception because of its high density, its long urban history, but in a relative, not small, but medium-sized territory, and which led to this situation of higher polycentricity. I should have mentioned polycentric studies as a development, a recent development that is also at odds with central place theory, but which use it as a counterpoint many times. So I would say that the spatial organization in urban hierarchies is still the major principle of spatial organization of cities in many countries today, provided that you don't interpret hierarchy as an hierarchy of nested dependencies, but as we do it now, as subsets of networks, and that may that have many different possible configurations, but which are not organized in such a way that city A would depend on city B, which would herself depend on city C, and so on. There is nothing. It is the organization of a spatial hierarchy among cities is not the same as the hierarchy of, as it is usually defined in a firm. It's something different. So if we admit this acceptation of hierarchy as being not a hierarchy like a genealogy of immediate dependency, we can admit that the central place organization is still prevalent in many regions of the world because historically the villages were spaced because they needed their local environment to survive. They were in competition. Some of them become cities, and the hierarchy was historically constructed using the previous settlements when they were not destroyed in a systematic way. So the urban hierarchies of today proceed from previous spatial organization where the distance constraint was heavier on the movement, but because precisely of the expansion of movements in number, in speed, in frequency in our societies, all settlements have grown more or less in parallel, in somehow homothetic ways, and then the spatial structure of the hierarchy has inherited of the previous spatial structure of central places. I would say that. What do you think, Evert? Is that an answer to your question?
It is, and thanks so much for it. I think we agree. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
There's an interesting question about international investment flows. How could you relate it with central place theory and economic activities?
Well, what is the main determination for international investment, at least today, where distances seem less important. But what counts is the return, the amount of expected return. And this is linked to the speed of development, either of population, of activities, of construction, and so on. So there is a lot of international investment looking for the best margins, either because of price of work. This is a long time ago. But many investments today are also made in the periphery of developing cities because it is there that the transformation, the added value for transforming the land, the rural land or nomadic land in urbanized land, there is a big profit to be made at those places. And so you find nowadays the firms constructing, developing the rapidly expanding cities of the poor countries as any investing funds internationally. And so it is what is new in the way, in the relationships between finance and the urban development.
Well, there are a few more questions, but Clementine?
Yes, I think we have time for maybe one or two more. So we've got another 8 minutes. I think maybe we can take at least one more.
Okay, then
if you're still okay, Denise, after this
yes,
firing of
there was a question whether central place theory holds at smaller spatial scales, but I think it's exactly what it does, isn't it? The question is, can it be applied to the intra-city level?
Yes, I apologize. I should have insisted on that because it was, of course, a concern of many scientists, and it gave rise to developments very interesting about what is the distance inside the city. I should consider time of travel in a closer way, and so, rather than cost, and so on. And the configuration of accessibility maps inside cities is different from what they are in the usual regional landscape. So many developments have been made. The surveys of consumer behavior by marketing firms is also very important inside cities. And the notion, the concept of level of an urban center inside a city is a slightly different from the characterization of small towns, medium-sized cities, and big metropolises, for instance. It is more delicate to qualify, and it evolves. For instance, in the recent literature, you find ideas of converting some of the big department stores in the middle of the largest cities, which were franchising international service firms differently, because perhaps they are adapted to the very supposed higher level of the foreign customers. But with the pandemics, this has been reconsidered. So you may have also an evolving sense of hierarchy inside a city for differentiating the small grouping of services you find below your apartment to the center you frequent once or twice in a year for a big adventure of shopping or purchasing.
Thank you very much. I think because that was the last two questions were related with this intracity type of question. I think what is left to say now is once again, thank you very much, Denise. Thank you to everyone. Thank you to everyone who joined, who asked questions. We're really happy about the turn up to this seminar. And I invite you, if you are interested, to the next seminar, who will take place on the 22nd of November. We will receive Justin Deloy, who will talk about Alonso's model. So it will be at the same time, same place. Actually, not the same place. The link will be sent once again 30 minutes before the seminar. Please register on Eventbrite, and the link is sent 30 minutes prior to the seminar. If that's too much information said at a too fast pace, you can find everything on our website, urbanmodseminar.nl. We're also on Twitter. And I think, yeah, one last thing to help with admitting you to the seminar is a request. Could you please register on Eventbrite and on the Zoom with the same name, so that we know how to admit you and admit you quicker. Once again, thank you very much to my co-organizer, Ruta and Ali. Thank you to Denise, and I hope everyone has a very smooth Monday and a smooth week. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.